Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Engaged podcast. It looks like James has changed.
He's put on weight, lost hair.
We should say the reason why James isn't with us today is because, very wonderfully, he is now on paternity leave. So massive congratulations to him. Ross, thank you so much for joining us. For those who are tuning in who don't know who you are, do you want to just quickly explain who you are?
Well, I used to work with children and young people, and I also say I'm Ross the boss. Mm-hmm. That's the best way to summarise me. I'm the Chief Exec of Care. So I've been here 3 years now, Peter.
Fantastic.
And did lots of things beforehand, but really enjoying my time here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for stepping into the breach in James's absence. We are going to be talking today about something which happened a week and a half ago now, and that is analysing the debate and indeed the result of the terminally ill adults end of life bill, or effectively are interested in is what we would call assisted suicide. It was quite a sad result, I think, for us at Care. It wasn't necessarily unexpected. I think we probably went into stuff feeling hopeful, but not necessarily expectant. Before we get into what actually happened, where were you watching the debate? Where were you? What were your feelings when the result was announced?
Well, slightly weirdly, I was nowhere near Westminster. I was near Euston Station.
Okay.
I had agreed to go to what was being billed as a retreat, but really was a sort of conference of Christians working in social action. Mm-hmm. And we were discussing the future of Christian social action in the UK. I thought it was a really important debate and conversation to be a part of, hosted by a Roman Catholic-based organisation, More in Common, but they gathered together. Interestingly, they categorised as one of three groups. You were either Catholic, Anglican or evangelical.
Interesting.
So going to All Souls Langham Place, I could not obviously be Anglican and evangelical. I had to be one or
which
the
one
other.
did you pick?
I was evangelical.
Yeah, I think that would probably be where I would fall as well.
So I was in this conference in this church building near Euston, tracking my phone when I was meant to be on sort of not tracking my phone.
Yeah.
I had subtitles on my screen around the speeches and was really moved by lots of speeches, just watching it on my small screen. And then obviously sort of when the vote came in, really disappointing. I sort of became the BBC news flash for the conference. So people were coming up to me saying, do you know what the vote is? And then I was telling them. So there was actually just a general sadness in the building, actually, when people sort of learned to vote.
Yeah, and I think that probably is pretty similar to my reaction, which was predominantly sad, I think, more than anything else. I did watch literally the entire thing. I don't think I even stepped out to get lunch.
But you're the type of person that goes to General Synod and listens to all the debates there.
Only because I have a vested interest. For those who don't know, my wife Sophie is on the General Synod. I'm not obsessed with church governance. So I did watch it all. But very, very sad at the end. You mentioned there that you were moved by a number of speeches. What were some of your highlights from the debate, or what are some things which stood out to you?
I think some people have described sort of the debate as Parliament at its best. I think there were elements of that were certainly true. So I think it was true that, broadly speaking, in the chamber on the day, there was a great deal of respect given to all the speakers. So people listened intently and respectfully. I think there was a great deal of sharing of emotion and personal experience. So the fact that actually MPs were humanised in many ways, both in terms of what moved their heart, but also the fact that sometimes it was personal experience as well. So I think it was good that people could see these aren't robots. We can't just dehumanize politicians. They are real people with real feelings. Yeah. And I think that the end of the debate, when the vote was announced, that was a really moving point, actually, because there's nearly, 99.9% of the time there's jeering and there's cheers and things like that. I think there was an acknowledgement and a realization that something profound had happened
Yes,
on
I
that
think
day,
that's
and the
true.
silence reflected that.
Yeah, I think there was an awareness of the gravity of the step which had just been taken. You mentioned some people have described it as Parliament at its best in a way which sort of suggested that you don't entirely agree with that sentiment. I'm interested in whether that is genuinely the case or whether I've just read too much into what you just said.
Well, yeah, I think why it's it's conditional, that statement for me, is because I think if I'm disappointed, it's because that so many parliamentarians seemingly, and I'll say that sort of just very carefully, seemingly made their decision on the basis of emotion and being moved emotionally.
Yeah.
Now, I think that it is really important that our legislators are compassionate and gracious, and therefore emotion absolutely has a part to play. But it seemed to me that there was often arguments that either didn't either stack up ideologically and philosophically or didn't stack up intellectually. And so the disappointment is that I know MPs were bombarded with loads and loads of information. But that does not mean that when you're overwhelmed with information, you don't take any of it in.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I also would have shied away from that phrase myself. And in fact, when I was reading something which has not yet gone out in Care's name, but is due to, I deliberately edited that phrase out. And part of the reason why was because I felt at times the debate was driven by scaremongering rather than actually looking at what the evidence is and what the impact of the decision will be. And in a sense, this could probably have been predicted in that it's not news that the strongest arguments for those who are putting forward the bill would be those which were rooted in someone's personal story or someone's experience of so-and-so experienced a really horrible death. And it is right to listen to that. But in the vast majority of cases, that has probably been the case because they haven't necessarily accessed palliative care. And so you end up with everyone feeling like their only real option is either you suffer a horrible death or you have this quick and painless way out. And that is a false dichotomy. And I think ultimately leads people to conclude, well, of course you should support this because, no one wants... How can you let people die in agony? Well, that doesn't happen most of the time when palliative care is genuinely done well. It can sometimes happen, but most of the time it probably doesn't. So I also would have shied away from the phrase Parliament.
Just on that point, again, I haven't got the reference for this, but a palliative care doctor whose opinion and knowledge on this I sort of respect, said to me that basically if you get very good palliative care, that there's only 2% of cases that they can't significantly reduce the pain. So it's only it's saying only 2%. That's 2% of people who will go through horrible, agonizing suffering that we have to sort of really grapple with and not dismiss. But to suggest that sort of the inability to control pain is widespread, medically, that's just not true.
Yeah, completely. And it's really interesting, I think, looking at the way certain words are sort of co-opted by one particular side. So one thing which I was glad didn't massively happen in this debate is it didn't kept on being repeated, only one side's got a monopoly on compassion, and I'm quite glad that wasn't the case. But there are a couple of things which I did pick up. One which I think Kim Ledbetter herself said, and this certainly was picked up by David Cameron, not in the debate, but ahead of the debate, suggesting that this is a bill which is about shortening death, not ending life. And you sort of think, gosh, that really is sleight of hand, particularly when you're talking about a 6-month time period in which I think the study in the Telegraph shows that doctors at least 50% of the time get it wrong if they're offering a 6-month prognosis. And sometimes, I think, was it I can't remember her name, but is it Mary Kelly Foy? There was a Labour MP who said, look, my daughter was given a 6-month prognosis endless times and she lived for 27 years.
Yeah.
And so the idea of this is just about shortening death, and I think that is actually not honest in terms of as a description. The other one, which I don't know whether you picked up on, which was fascinating in terms of the attempt to police language, was, I think it was Kat Eccles, a Labour MP, who tried to interrupt Danny Kruger and said, stop using the words assisted suicide. And Danny Kruger quite rightly said, look, the fact is this is amending the Suicide Act. So the idea that you can't even use words because they're deemed offensive, I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think in an age where until quite recently we were slightly dismissive of the power of language and the power of words, of saying, oh, well, you know, every can be interpreted in your own way, etc. I think what this debate has shown is language and words become incredibly powerful and symbolic and significant. So, the reality is, you know, often I have to sort of consciously remind myself not to just use assisted dying, or I only use that phrase now where I know it's almost more problematic in terms of causing controversy to use assisted suicide. But when you use assisted dying, it is the power of, if you like, those who are in favour of the legislation changing, you intentionally using a language that is moderate, mild, and even at times misleading. And we know it's misleading because lots of the opinion polls, when people have said they support assisted dying, when you then ask a follow-up question about what do they understand that to be, often it means like people think it's the withdrawal of medication, not actually the act of helping somebody die or killing somebody and administering drugs. So that sort of idea of bringing forward death, or rather than shortening life, just demonstrates actually how language is really powerful and how we need to be really careful to not seed the ground on some of the vocabulary. Yeah,
no, I think that's absolutely right. You mentioned that you were sort of having to try and follow along clandestinely on your phone, which I'm sure we have all been there, albeit sometimes for checking the cricket score. Did you have any sort of MVPs in the debate? Were there any particular speakers which you thought, gosh, that has really got something substantial and something really important in it?
Well, just go back a bit, Peter.
Yeah.
If you're a Spurs fan or a Welsh rugby fan like me, you don't keep on checking the score because it's normally bad news. Can I just sort of throw in a real curveball in terms of sort of the MVP, most valuable parliamentarian?
Go for it.
Diane Abbott.
Funny enough, she would have been on my list of 3. So you take Diane Abbott and then I'll go next.
Well, I think for somebody who's often lambasted for not being the most intellectually dynamic member of the House of Commons, and somebody who's often parodied in sort of their portrayal of her, I think, again, using vocabulary intentionally, I think the dignity with which she held stood up and spoke, and the sense that, again, for a mild lefty like me, that she rooted her argument in a sense of wanting to protect the most vulnerable, the limitations of the state when it comes to life, and that communitarian principle of the common good. And I think those 3 things, they were visibly rare in that debate for me, which was really significant given that we've got such a large majority of Labour MPs. How rare those things were referenced was really a surprise to me, a disappointment to me.
Well, we can come on to why the result was where it was shortly. Because I also have thoughts on the Labour MPs not referencing protecting the vulnerable more. I agree that Diane Abbott I thought was exceptional. I thought, gosh, that. I really respected her for what she said, and I thought her points on coercion were brilliant in terms of actually understanding that coercion doesn't normally mean like that like you get you get a note afterwards, and actually her point on look, coercion is often about what you don't say as much as what it is about what you do say, and I think she sort of described like the kind of long, meaningful pause, I thought was bang on, I thought the end to Danny Kruger's speech was excellent, when he again was talking about protecting the vulnerable. And he asked, look, I mean, what are the safeguards for those who are most vulnerable in our society? And he sort of said, look, we all meet people like this in our constituencies. And he said, look, we are the safeguard. And this parliament is the place which protects people. I thought, gosh, that is... It was a way of thinking about parliament, which actually I haven't heard it described in as strong terms as that before.
Yeah.
And which I thought was really meaningful within the debate. I'll add in one third one, and just because it was someone who I'd never heard of before, but having now looked her up on Twitter, I sort of think, gosh, yeah, I agree with you on quite a lot. Have you come across Jessa Sato?
No, I haven't. Yeah, and this again, the downside of being in a conference, I obviously missed her contribution.
Yeah. So she's a new Labour MP. Yeah. And she effectively spoke on the disproportionate way in which women experience coercion compared to men. And so this is probably a more of a kind of stereotypical or traditional Labour way of viewing things. But realising, look, this does not actually happen fairly. Women are more often the subjects of, say, abuse or domestic violence, and therefore they will be more likely to run the risk of being coerced. And so in order to protect the vulnerable, in this case, women who might be at risk of coercion, I have no option really but to vote this down. And I thought, gosh, fair play to you making that speech when you're a new MP. And I thought she was excellent.
Just on that, I mean, I was really moved, I think, by Chinny MacDonald from Theos, wrote an article, which I think, if I'm right, she got quite a lot of flack for from people who I think were sort of slightly racist in their comments about it, where she wrote an article just commenting and observing that lots of people who are advocating for this bill to get to be passed tend to be white and middle class.
Yeah, completely.
And all she was observing was saying that, well, if you understand and appreciate some black communities in particular, you understand that some of the philosophies and the ethos of those communities are coming from a very different place, and the sense that it's important to listen to those voices, to understand how an individual in many of those communities is not an individual as an island, but part of a family, part of a household, part of a community, and that the loss or death of an individual is a loss to the community as a whole. And the flip side of that, the community's responsibility around caring for those people as well. I think it was a really challenging article for me of something that I probably, in the back of my mind, had been a niggle. And it took somebody like Janine, from her background and perspective, to vocalise something in a really authentic way.
Yeah, and actually, sort of one of the interesting things with that, I don't have the numbers to hand. I think I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that those who are from a black and ethnic minority background were much more likely to vote against the bill than to vote for it compared to those who were not. So that was absolutely borne out in the way it went. Shall we think about why the bill passed? What is your analysis in terms of why have the numbers ended up being what they are?
I think there's probably three things that I don't think they're the only factors, but I think they're three important factors. One is, I think there's the culture that we're in. And so I think everything in the world around us was pointing to saying it's all about individual choice.
Yeah.
We all have agency. This is a way to avoid suffering. And isn't it good that people have individual choice in every area of life? And this is sort of the one area that was the presenting issue. So culture was against the opposition to the bill.
Yeah.
Secondly, to go sort of to the other extreme of from everybody and everything to just one person, I think the Prime Minister was very careful to not publicly comment on this in any way. I don't think that meant that anybody was in any doubt about how he would vote and what he supported.
Yeah.
And I think if you are a new Labour MP, I don't think it's insignificant that if you don't know how to vote, you will look for a lead from your leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think people who were thinking, how shall I vote, don't know, see arguments either way. I think there were people like the Secretary for Health, for Justice, the Deputy Prime Minister. Those were all influential voices, but ultimately I think the Prime Minister sort of carries sway.
Yeah.
So I think there was that. And then I think the third one was, and this is I think where my disappointment comes in, I think that rather than take the medical principle of do no harm, and therefore if you're in doubt, just don't do harm, I think people were assured that they could potentially build in sufficient safeguards.
Yeah.
And so I think there were seeming compromises made on the day around, saying, we'll take evidence and oral evidence and written evidence in the committee stage of this bill. This is the sort of the safest bill of the kind of this sort in sort of anywhere in the world. I think that probably did sway some people to think, okay, well, we'll give it the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I think the other aspect of this is just for parliamentary arithmetic in that it is, well, it's not quite unprecedented, but it is very, very rare that we've had a parliament which has had quite this one-sided a makeup. So I can't remember. It's the lowest number of Conservative MPs in 100 years.
And what I'd add to that, Peter, is that actually I don't think it's simply a matter of Labour versus Conservative. No. So I think that one of the factors was that if the 70 Lib Dems had reflected the voting patterns of the Conservatives, then it would have been a lot closer.
Well, I think that's exactly it. So if you think back to 97, the Conservatives have certainly considerably more MPs than they do now. But the Lib Dems ended up being almost 90% in favour of it, and the Conservatives ended up being 80% against it. Labour was sort of 60-40. Now, that is a fairly unique kind of parliamentary setup in terms of how few Conservatives there were, but also, as you rightly say, it's not just based on who is there from what party. So within, I thought it was really interesting actually. Within both Labour and the Conservatives, you could see a clear ideological split. So within Labour, in the sort of 60-40, you have on one side those who are sort of like to be seen as progressives and kind of making change, and society is going in one direction. And I think Jess Phillips, I appreciate how straight talking she is, but I was like, gosh, I really don't agree with that. Where she was interviewed and said, look, there are problems with it and it might do some bad things, but you can't stand in the way of progress. Like, well, yes, you can. If it's like people who are dying, if there's one time to stand in the way of progress, it would be when the stakes are that high. And so you had the progressives on one side, and on the other side, you had the sort of more old school kind of Labour people who were viewing things through a lens of protecting the vulnerable. And on that side, you would have various people who I might disagree with on all manner of things, and dare I say, you might too. But they, I think, probably have a vision of the common good, or they have a vision of a society and how we don't just exist as individuals. So I think that was probably part of it. It was interesting seeing a similar thing in reverse on the Conservative side. So even though the Conservatives were 80-20 in terms of percentage, among the 20% who voted for it were Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Oliver Dowden, Mel Stride, kind of various people, almost a disproportionate number who have actually been in the government. in recent years. And I thought that was interesting too, in terms of those who might be seen as more centrist within the Conservative Party have again looked probably to downplay being conservative and have been quite happy to fall in behind what they see as more fashionable causes, almost in a sort of David Cameron-esque way.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is I don't think many of those would say that they held an ideological viewpoint on the issue. Of course, they do, whether they acknowledge it or not, or whether they are conscious of it or not. But I think that, again, one of the striking things for me was the much of the debate, not even in the chamber, but before the day as well, sort of came down to the pragmatics and practicalities. And so I think they were legitimate concerns to raise about how is this going to work in practice. But what I was worried about, with such a focus on, how difficult this is going to be really impossible to work out how to work, or we need to sort out palliative care, and then we'll sort of, there's a real choice that you can make, is that again seeded the ground on the ethics and the morality of this.
I was coming on to this.
So there was a bit of me that was worried that I would have rejoiced if the bill had fallen at the second reading. But my concern, if that had happened, was that we would have won it on the basis of, well, we'd win the battle, but had we already lost the war because we'd given up the principle and the ethics and the morality behind it.
I think that is bang on. And the number of people who within the debate said, I support the principle of this, was really quite high. I had effectively had a similar thought, because it's not impossible, it's perhaps unlikely, but it's not impossible that it might fall at third reading. But the reality is that the principle has already kind of Parliament has expressed a view on that,
and even further that in theory, let's say the bill goes forward and has royal assent, if you had not, if people were neutral, let's say, on the morality of assisted suicide, you would say that there's a greater prospect that, okay, after 6 months, after 12 months, after 3 years, we could more objectively look at the evidence of how it was working and decide that, oh, actually, this is not going well. Let's reverse the legislation. Now, if you've already seeded the morality behind it and saying, in principle, I'm supportive, then the confirmation bias is going to say you're going to look for evidence of why it's working, not be more objective in sort of saying, where does the evidence lead us to? And therefore, the likelihood of any bad legislation being reversed is less.
Yeah. Well, I guess from a Christian point of view then, so we thought about why the vote went where it did. From a Christian point of view, how do we respond when something like this happens? Do we get angry? Do we get upset? What are some of your reflections on how we might think through and process it from a Christian point of view?
Yeah, I think it's right to feel sad. It's right to even have a sense of righteous anger at times as well. I think if you look at David in the Psalms, the fact that he was very raw sometimes in his emotions, I think it's about not lashing out and responding simply emotionally to something.
Yeah.
So I think we sort of need to understand that we will have an emotional reaction to what's just happened because it's so important and so profound. If I didn't feel sad about it, I would be worried because that would mean, have I been numbed by the world to be desensitized to such a profound change? But what can we do to change it? I think going back to what I just said, we don't give up.
Yeah.
So when the week before I was reading Daniel, and that famous scene of Daniel's friends going into the fiery furnace. Yeah. And I can never quote biblical verses correctly, so forgive me. But they, paraphrasing, they sort of said, well, we have faith and trust that the Lord could save us. But even if he doesn't, we're going to be faithful. And so I think for us as the gender, what does faithfulness look like in a let's project forward? Let's say there's a post-assisted suicide sort of world or a world where that's legalized. What does faithfulness look like? I think faithfulness is not conforming to the world's standards and sort of accepting it and normalizing it. I think there's a sort of faithfulness in saying, well, if I don't believe it is right, then what are the actions and steps I take to be to do an act of resistance? And I don't mean that in a sort of a violent way or a sort of in a way, but what I mean by an act of resistance is, what is it that I can do that will promote good?
Yeah.
What is it that I can do that sort of leans into the fact that I believe if I want to put my actions and my behaviors and my money and my efforts into thinking that all life is precious until the Lord takes it, then how am I sort of speaking to my church leaders around saying, is there something that we can do about caring for the elderly?
Yeah.
That may not mean that you can open a hospice, but it may mean that actually you can befriend elderly people who are lonely in your neighborhoods, so that down the line, they're not the group that will feel pressurized or informally coerced into ending their life early because it's not a value and not a worth. So what does it look like for the church to really value the vulnerable, the marginalized, the disenfranchised? What does it look like to sort of for the church to think about those groups who are in the firing line of this legislation down the line where it gets expanded, if it gets expanded? So I think there's room for supporting people like care to have the conversations and bring people together around what does palliative care look like, what does social care for the elderly look like, what does care and support for disabled people look like. We know in Canada, what does homes for the homeless look like, because they're a vulnerable category, and what does good mental health provision look like? I think there's a Christian response to that, and I think too frequently we've allowed sort of through the NHS, the world to define what solutions to some of those challenges are, without thinking, is there a distinctly Christian response to those things that may work alongside the state, may supplant the state, may complement the state's provision? But I think that's a real challenge for us now, not to sort of assume that hospitals, I don't want to be sort of melodramatic about this, but if hospitals are, for some people, not going to feel like a safe space anymore, what do we do to ensure that that safe space exists?
Yeah, no, I think that is all very helpful. And I mean, one reflection which I had from a Christian point of view on the debate was the seeds for effectively the philosophy which lies behind this result was sown a very long time ago. And actually, the better story which we need to tell society is not just about end of life. It is about how autonomy is not the sole ultimate good. And freedom is obviously a good thing, but it is also balanced out by love of God and love of neighbour. And so the story which we tell society has got to include those things too, or else you end up with effectively the idolatry of the self. And that is how essentially we've ended up in a position where we have, as a society, decided we would rather prioritise individual freedom, particularly for some of those who are most privileged, over those who are most vulnerable, which is a really tragic state of affairs. But yeah, effectively, I think our vision for society has got to be much bigger than perhaps we might have thought it should be.
And that's why Christianity, I think, has a unique role to play and a sort of unique offer to the world, doesn't it? Because actually, politically, we really want sort of have a binary adversarial world where it's sort of right of centre individuals or left of centre sort of communitarian sort of common good sort of thing, and it's sort of at the expense, one is at the expense of the individual or the individual at the expense of the community and the group. But the Bible says no, actually both are important. Both are an integral part of God's better plan for the world.
Yeah, completely. I also really like what you were talking about there in terms of a much bigger vision for what it looks like to care for the elderly. I don't have a copy with me, which is very frustrating. But we did have a delivery just yesterday of a new biblical deep dive on
Did we,
a
Peter?
better story
Did
for
we?
old age. We did.
Tell me more about that. What's in it?
Well, I wrote it. No, it's an in-depth look at what the Bible says about old age, effectively. Not looking to shy away from the difficulties which old age might bring, but looking to tell a better story for what is a distinctive Christian vision on what old age can look like. And I think within it, I looked at 5 different kind of touch points on which we have a better narrative than what the world can offer. So that was things like purpose and community, and a way of kind of living through suffering, and a way of living with hope. And I can't remember the fifth one.
I was going to say you can't remember all the 5 points.
Dignity, I think, was the final one. So if you are interested in that, you can find an electronic version up on the CARE website, along with lots of other great resources. But if you do want a printed version, please do get in contact with us and we will send one to you.
And if only you had been raised as a Baptist, you would have had alliterative points and it would have been much easier to remember.
But I'd only have had 3 as well. And I mean, you can't just limit yourself to 3 points. I'm conscious that we probably ought to wrap up. Thank you very much for stepping into James's shoes.
And I'm sorry that I haven't got a big floppy Bible.
Well, indeed, and I mean, this feels like one of the least chaotic recordings we've done for some time. So we'll have to see whether our audience thinks that is a good thing or not. So I don't know. Thank you very much for
Peter.
kind of chatting stuff through. And if you are still looking at how to respond, we've got lots of stuff up on the CARE website, including articles which were written responding to the debate directly. So please do head up onto there. And we will see you soon. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you.